Just a lot of great songs on it. Let's talk about it. You just decided to call it Alice in Chains this time, right?
Yeah, we basically couldn't think of anything else to call it.
There are days like that, right? I mean, it's true.
Actually, we never called or used the self-titled record thing, so it's kind of good that we held out on that.
Cool, you always have that option, right?
So we got stumped on this one.
In 1995, Alice in Chains would release their final studio album with frontman Layne Staley. While Dirt served as a warning sign, their self-titled album was a sonic farewell. The album would be graced by a three-legged dog, and one of my favorite explanations for the three-legged dog is that it represents Alice in Chains, who by this point in time was a wounded animal. The album would debut at #1 and move several million copies, despite the fact that Alice in Chains only played 5 live shows to support the record and made limited TV appearances. Alice in Chains nearly imploded in the summer of 1994 following the release of their EP Jar of Flies. The band's opening slot for Metallica later that year would be cancelled after frontman Layne Staley returned from rehab, only to show up high to rehearsals, resulting in infighting within the group, with drummer Sean Kinney threatening to never play with Layne again. Guitarist Jerry Cantrell would tell Rolling Stone, "We've been going full force, just running at top speed with our eyes closed. We've been way too close for too long and we were suffocating. We were like 4 plants trying to grow inside the same pot." With Layne Staley adding, "When we first got together as a band, we were all brothers. We lived in the same house and partied together and drank as much as each other. But then we started to split apart and went different ways. We felt like we were betraying each other," he'd say. It was during the time that the members drifted apart that Layne took up the side project Mad Season with Mike McCready of Pearl Jam and Barrett Martin of Screaming Trees, as well as John Baker Saunders of the Walkabouts. The group would enjoy some success with their lone album Above, which came out in March of 1995. Cantrell meanwhile envisioned doing a solo project working with Scott Rockwell, the drummer for one-time touring mates Grunt Truck. Side note, guys, I've done a whole video on Grunt Truck, the link is down below. Rockwell would recall to author David DeSola in the book Alice in Chains, The Untold Story, "I was playing drums and he was playing guitar," referring to Jerry, "and we'd record and then he'd pick up the bass and put down some bass tracks and stuff. So we worked on 3 songs, and I think 2 of them made the album," referring to Alice in Chains' self-titled record. After 3 songs were written, including Again and Grind, the pair would head down to the studio for pre-production. Jerry's initial idea was to get Jar of Flies producer Toby Wright on board and try to coax the other members of the band to come work on new songs while Layne was off with Mad Season. After things with Mad Season slowed down, Layne was once again invited back to the band to work on new material. Jerry's idea was that if things didn't work out with Alice, then he would release the material under a solo record. The label, though, wasn't happy with Toby Wright being chosen as the producer, as Nick Terza, who signed Alice in Chains and worked for the band's label, Sony, thought that Wright was an enabler to Layne and more of an engineer than producer. But Wright would defend himself in the same book, saying that he had a special relationship with Layne and he could relate, having gone through some of his own personal problems. The band would opt to work on their next record at Band Animal's studio, since it was a stone's throw away from where Layne lived. Despite the band's internal problems, they were also dealing with external problems like their management and record label. According to the book Alice in Chains, The Untold Story, the band made most of the record without manager Susan Silver or the record label being in the know as to what was going on. While the band was coming off a string of hit albums, their label Sony didn't think that the band was going to be able to even produce another record due to internal problems with the band. In addition to that, the band would end up taking over Bad Animal Studio for 24 hours a day, as Layne was mostly working during the nights and the rest of the band would come in during the days. Since Layne was struggling with addiction, they never really knew when he would show up in the studio. According to producer Toby Wright, who told author David DeSola, it was during the making of the record that he started to wear a beeper so those working at the studio could let him know when Layne showed up. It resulted in a lot of nothing happening some nights, and it would take 6 months to record the album, with the band's previous efforts being done in a third of the time. Another factor that contributed to the album taking so long was the fact that Layne was writing lyrics off the top of his head, so he would work out a lot of ideas while in the studio. The problems that plagued the band prior to their breakup were merely shoved under the carpet instead of being addressed, with guitarist Jerry Cantrell revealing in the book Grunge is Dead. It was a really painful session because it took so long. It was horrifying to see Layne in that condition. Yet when he was cognizant, he was the sweetest, bright-eyed guy you'd ever want to meet. To be in a meeting with him and have him fall asleep in front of you was gut-wrenching. Drummer Sean Kinney would reveal in the book Everybody Loves Our Town. A lot of the songs that Jerry and Layne wrote, you can hear what they have to say to each other right there. It's spelled out in a roundabout way. It's a way more malicious and brutal album than Dirt was, he'd say. The lyrics weren't just limited to taking shots at each other, as the press and the record label soon became targets as well. It It was during this time many rumors floated around about Layne's health, missing teeth, missing arms, and it would result in the song Grind, which took a shot at the press for speculating. It was also during the recording of the album that Mad Seasons Above would go gold, and Sony would call up Layne in the studio and congratulate him on the feat, while also threatening him, telling him he only had 9 days to finish up the Alice in Chains record. This would result in the song Sludge Factory. While it's been speculated that the dog on the front cover of the album was Jerry's, it wasn't. The inspiration for the cover was a 3-legged dog who used to terrorize Sean Kinney around his neighborhood when he was a kid. Meanwhile, bassist Mike Inez would have some somber thoughts looking back at the record, telling author Greg Prado, "That was a really dark time. I look at the album cover, it was very gray, and I think that's where we were at. Layne was going through the depths of his heroin addiction. It was really tough watching that, and that permeated into everything we did." Even Susan Silver, who was the band's manager and mostly shut out of the recording, would tell Greg Prado in Grunge is Dead, "It took 8 or 9 months and hours of waiting for Layne to come out of the bathroom. Days of waiting for him to show up in the studio, and through all those last years he and I were very close. I kept telling him, you don't have to do this. You have enough money to go live a quiet life if that's what you want. Don't do this if that's what's perpetuating your addiction." She would go on to reveal that due to Layne's personal problems, the sessions for the album had to be stopped several times, and that it wasn't, I quote, tearing everybody to shreds. It got to the point where Sony threatened to pull support for the album and stop paying for studio time if Layne didn't start showing up regularly to recording sessions. Eventually, the album got done. Released on November 3rd, 1995, the album would debut at #1 on the Billboard charts, but the LA Times would write an article about the album in 1996 about how the band's personal problems were costing them millions of dollars and prevented them from touring extensively, and how Stone Temple Pilots who were dealing with similar problems could relate. STP's manager would tell the LA Times, "For a rock and roll band, touring is essential for album sales. When you simply put tickets on sale, the mere event excites people, and there's a lot of radio promotion and media coverage. It feeds on itself," he'd say. The article would go on to state, "STP isn't alone. Seattle band Alice in Chains hasn't toured for 3 years, in part because of singer Layne Staley's battle with addiction, and its sales also reflect that absence." The band's latest album, Alice in Chains, got off to a hot start when it debuted last November. Without a tour to support it, though, sales quickly slowed, and the total is now 1.2 million, a healthy amount, but only half of the band's bestseller, 1992's Dirt. Guitarist Jerry Cantrell would take on a bigger role when it came to singing duties, crediting Layne with pushing him out of his comfort zone, singing lead vocals on Heaven Beside You, Grind, and Over Now. Back in those days, it was pretty common for labels to ask for bands to do electronic press kits where they typically talk about their new album and the band, but Alice in Chains wanted to do something different, releasing a mockumentary called the Nona Tapes. The idea for the mockumentary was Layne's, according to David DeSolo's book. Director Rocky Schneck, who had shot their self-titled album cover and video for Grind, in addition to previously working with the band on their past efforts, would shoot the mockumentary. For the mockumentary, Cantrell would dress up as a TV interviewer named Nona Weisbaum, who would interview the band members. The label, though, wasn't happy with the mockumentary, but it soon developed a cult following, and is actually up on the band's YouTube channel if you want to go check it out. In 2020, Jerry would dress up as his character again for a live stream event, when the band became the recipient of the Museum of Pop Culture's Founders Awards event in Seattle. That does it for today's video, guys. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like button, subscribe, and we'll see you again in Rock Culture Stories. Take care.